It's only been a short amount of time, and I know I haven't sampled every McFarlane out there, but this is probably my favorite so far. Hey everyone, David here. I know it's been, as the kids say, a minute since I've tried and reviewed another McFarlane toy, but trust me, they are going to be rolling full speed ahead in the new year. But let me attempt at placating that by providing you guys my review of Armored Batman from The Dark Knight Returns, provided to you by McFarlane Toys. I've seen this guy float around quite an awful lot in the wild, from Best Buy to Walmart, hell, even Target. I've seen it a couple of times, and it's always appealed to me, really. I've always liked the look and the design of it, especially since it's taken directly from the Frank Miller comic or graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns, except there's some stylistic choices that again are very traditional for McFarlane to do with some of their iterations, while at the same time trying to be faithful to that original source material, that original interpretation of Batman or whatever kind of iteration of that character it's taken from. And sometimes it's yielded great results, other times it hasn't exactly fared well. See my review of the animated series Batman from McFarlane Toys for reference. Here, however, I feel like we have a really decent and subtle marriage of the two that I think worked ultimately in their favor. As you see before you, it's definitely reminiscent of the armored Batman that we get in the climax of The Dark Knight Returns, where he takes up the Man of Steel himself, and the armor itself looks absolutely amazing in the 7-inch scale, and they spare no expense. Like, this guy is designed and manufactured like he's supposed to be. A tank, an absolute unit of a Batman here. And he definitely feels the presence, and you definitely feel the heft and the absolute integrity of the sculpting and the detail going on in his armor that I just couldn't help but marvel at him, even after taking him out of the package. I've already known how he looks like in person because I've seen him in stores, but finally taking him out of the box, he feels like a statue while at the same time knowing that he's very much an action figure, so he's not static in terms of like posability or movement. You know that you can definitely, play around with him and do different things, but just being able to kind of gaze at the actual look and detail of the armor itself is just immaculate. All the while, you can also see that he's not necessarily absolutely 100% accurate to the way that he looks like in the Frank Miller graphic, because in that book, he looks a little stockier, a little bit more exaggerated from the horizontal perspective, because that's ultimately Frank Miller's kind of aesthetic and design choice. Here you can see that he's a little bit more lankier on a vertical scale. You can kind of see that he's a bit more on the taller side, or you know what I mean? Like, there's more verticality to the way that he's designed versus the way that he comes across in the graphic novel. In the graphic novel, he's almost always hunched over, especially when he's not wearing the armored suit. He's wearing the traditional Batman suit. He has more of a huskier kind of tone to his definition, whereas here you can see that he's just towering. And again, the actual building of the toy itself, as well as the actual manufacturing of the pieces, individual pieces from the knees to the thigh paddings, and then the overall build of the chest piece here. I mean, it's a little bit of a bummer that the original Frank Miller design never really went for a bat symbol on his chest, but I feel like the armor itself kind of speaks volumes for that. You don't need to have a symbol to know exactly who this is. So I guess that's the devil's advocate argument to kind of do away with that. So with that said, the chest piece, you definitely feel the actual build behind it. It doesn't feel hollow. It feels like one exact piece, while at the same time moving around the shoulders. Very reminiscent of those Warhammer 4K kind of armor suits, while at the same time still adding that traditional Batman flair with the actual spikes on his gauntlets and the boots. Now, the ones on the boots are actually made out of rubber as opposed to the hard plastic that embodies the rest of the costume and the suit here. However, when we move down to the feet, ultimately, in my opinion, is my favorite feature, or design feature rather, which is going to be the tactical gripping spikes that they took from the original design and threw them on the figure itself. It's crazy. I mean, yeah, you still have the holes to put that circular base in case you want to, but who the hell really needs that when you got, again, the absolute unit that is Dark Knight Returns Armored Batman here, with those massive feet, great building and balance around the sculpting of the feet itself, and when you add these pins right here at the bottom of his feet, he's got no problems standing on his own. So balancing and posability is going to be absolutely not a single problem. And then moving on to the top of the figure, you then have a cowl where you see a few more of those distinctive McFarlane figure details that they kind of take liberties with, because I do not remember seeing this in the design for The Dark Knight Returns, possibly the animated film, which as of the time of this recording I have not seen, but I have read the Frank Miller graphic novel, and I don't remember seeing too much detail or lining going around the cowl, so you can see a little bit of that being interpreted here in McFarlane toy form. Now, I don't know if this was an isolated thing, if it's just my specific figure, but mine unfortunately came with a slightly warped ear at the top of the cowl. However, if you look at it from one perspective, you can argue that that's battle damage after his bout with Superman. And then moving on back to the cape, which is another one of my favorite details of the figure thus far, and ultimately, I'm going to say it, one of my favorite capes out of McFarlane so far as well, because it is still rubber like the other ones before, but they went with a textured, matted look that authentically looks like a cape. I mean, if you take it at surface value, it legitimately looks like a cloth cape, but it's actually a rubber piece that just happens to have that texturized feel. Now, I don't know how I feel about the fact that it smells like those Halloween masks, those very value Walmart kind of Halloween masks. Don't ask me how I smelt it, but I smelt it, and that's just how it comes across. But if that is what it's going to take to get this desired effect, which I absolutely am in love with, then have at it, because this is ultimately one of my favorite capes. You can definitely see the texture and the definition coming across. Would have liked to see it just a little wider, just to have it kind of give the more imposing and intimidating look as prior Batmans that I've covered before, but the armor is gonna do that just fine. Now, some of you may be wondering, just like I was prior to actually taking the figure out, how does articulation fare off on such a beefy and massive figure such as this? Are there going to be conflicts of interest as far as moving pieces within each other because of how big and ultimately thick he is? That's actually not as much of a problem as I was anticipating it to be, though it does come with its few quirks that could have been handled just a little better. One of which is in fact the head. I would love to say that you could turn it 360 degrees, and you kind of can, but you have to pivot it upwards. So he's going to glide along the rim that he has around the neckline here of his armor. But if you want to rotate it the full 360 degrees uncompromised, you're not going to be able to do that because of the chin piece here. So that does come in the way just a tiny bit. But as you see me mention and kind of demonstrate just slightly, there is a slight pivot joint that allows the head to kind of incline inwards and outwards, as well as pivot up and down slightly. He can't really look all the way up like he's looking up at Superman, but you can kind of get the gist of it right there. And then we get to what I think is slightly the more problematic parts of the articulation, which are going to be his shoulders. As per all the McFarlane figures, they pride themselves in the 22 points of articulation, but it doesn't come across too well when it comes to the shoulders because of the way that the armor and these shoulder pieces are constructed. If you guys remember my Arkham Knight comparison video where I talk about the DC collectibles and the McFarlane toy versions of the Arkham Knight Batman, you'll remember that one thing that they kind of carried on over were the shoulder pieces being glued onto the outer part of the shoulder as opposed to the top part, or at least this other centralized armor piece, so that then they can enable a little bit more movability and posability. They do a similar thing here. Well, you'll notice that the shoulder pieces, these armor shoulder pieces, are glued onto the outermost part of the shoulder. However, it's still, because of how thick everything is, it still kind of conflicts a tiny little bit. So moving the arms vertically, you can actually do so the full 360, but then moving out horizontally is when it gets a little complicated. This shoulder is a little bit more generous because then you have the other joint on the inside of the shoulder. Like all the other McFarlanes, you have one ball joint and then you have another cutout on the inside to allow more flexibility and extension outwards. It allows it to do about that much, at least for this arm. Once we get to this arm, I don't know, again, it might be an isolated incident, but when I get to this arm, I start to get a little bit of resistance once we get to I almost want to say the 45-degree angle. And then if I go any further, pow, dislocates the shoulder, if you will. Thankfully, it's not broken. You can see it's a ball joint and it just pops back into place. With a little bit, there you go, a little bit of force, you hear that very satisfying pop. So it goes back in, but because of those shoulder pieces, that's already had a tendency to happen a handful of times. So I don't know if it's just going to be my figure. If anybody owns this guy, please let me know in the comments. Does the shoulder pop off that frequently on the right, or does it happen to you on the left, or is it like a universal thing that has happened to an awful lot of these versions out there? So please let me know. Once we get down here, though, there's not as much torso movability, of course, because this is all one ginormous piece, but I am thankful that they still threw in a decent amount of waist articulation and also a vertical joint inside of that waist. So there's nothing going on here on the upper obliques, but down here at the bottom where you see the belt, he actually can flex up and down. So if you want to give him that added movement of being able to look up at Superman, you could still do so, just not at the neck, but rather at the waist. Then we get to the top of the legs. The top of the legs are a little complicated as well. He can move them forwards about that much, and then actually quite an awful lot back, and then about that much outwards. It's using a similar principle here in the top ball joints of the legs, similar to that of the shoulders, where there's an extra little joint, or it might still be a ball joint that just happens to have an added piece of movement of separation to allow this to kind of happen, because I sense the joint kind of moving in and of itself in there as I move the legs. It's difficult to explain or to have it come across on camera, but upon moving the legs, I can feel it kind of gestate a little bit differently than when I move it forwards or back, if that makes any kind of sense. And there's slight circular movement horizontally, as you see like that, but nothing too crazy, because once again, like other McFarlanes, this entire crotch or bottom piece, underwear piece, is one singular piece to kind of mask the joints, so they put that there as well. And then moving down to the knees, you do have two joints that allow very generous movement about that much back, not really a whole lot going forward. And then we move on to the bottom here. You can see a little bit of movement in the shins, but that's primarily because, like I said before, this piece, as opposed to the rest of the armor pieces, are actually made out of rubber for gentle movement, as well as flexibility of the ankle, so you can kind of move them about horizontally, as you see before you, like that, as well as pivot up and down. And frankly, regardless of how big or small your McFarlane toy is going to be, they are going to throw in the toesies. And I was just flabbergasted by the fact that they still threw in the toesy articulation, even with a massive unit like Dark Knight Returns Armored Batman here. And before I forget, we do have elbow joints, and there was a reason why I waited until the last minute here to cover the arms here. It's because we're about to segue into the accessories, which are sadly a little lackluster. But before we get to that, you do have at least one joint in the elbow, and there's even a somewhat hidden joint right above the elbow that allows the bottom part of the arm to rotate left and right. And then of course you have a joint on the wrists that allow the movement of the hands 360 degrees, which it needs to, because that's how you're going to be able to swap out the other pairs of hands, which are sadly the only accessories that Dark Knight Returns Armored Batman came with. Which, I mean, I get it. You know, he didn't really use much of anything else in that fight with Superman while he was wearing this, because ultimately the armored suit is going to take care of business. But I do wish that this is one of the areas that McFarlane would have taken their liberties and thrown in a couple of accessories that may have not been canon, or maybe have been kind of off in the side or in the background, and still kind of given the figure some extra value, because all they really threw in for accessories are an extra pair of hands. Now, a little bit of a cheat here. The extra pair of hands it came with are actually the ones that he's sporting right now, which are these relaxed hands. And the reason why I decided to start the review for these is because they're both uniformal. They're identically the same hand, only one for the left and the right. But they're relaxed hands, and the ones that he came prepackaged with are these two hands, which are meant to be the much more dynamically different ones that you can then swap in and out for. The right hand is meant to be more like a pointed hand, so it's maybe meant to taunt Superman, if you want to look at it that way. And then the left hand is a proper fist punching hand. And swapping them in and out is, of course, fairly simple. You just give it a quick tug, like so. You see the joint right there. It's kind of a ball joint, but at the same time, it's mildly squared up to kind of give it an extra added friction. You give it a slight little push, you feel the pop go in, and as you see right there, you got now a fist hand. So kind of self-explanatory, but like I mentioned before, would have been nice if they threw in at least one extra accessory, maybe like a piece of debris that he uses to pummel Superman, or like the bat signal, or something else. I don't know. I just feel like it's a little lackluster on the accessories. I understand that he didn't really use much else in the actual story, or even the animated movie, to say the least. But I think with what I've seen McFarlane do in the past, or even in the future with soon-to-be released figures, it left a little bit to be desired in the accessory category. And there he is, ready to ask Superman, "Do you bleed?" Because you will. And I will be enjoying this figure for some time. And I'm glad to get that off my chest, because I feel like despite having some affinities and things to really enjoy about the last handful of McFarlanes that I've covered, I don't think it's been since Arkham Knight Batman or even Arkham Origins Deathstroke that I've been enjoying a McFarlane figure this much. From a design standpoint, from a sculpting standpoint, accessories were leaving a lot to be desired, but that's where maybe some custom companies out there that could maybe make something for the figure come into play, or maybe just kind of mix and match the other forms of accessories that McFarlane Toys are able to provide on the side, such as those bat cycles like the Bat Raptor, etc., and kind of, role play a little bit to say that this is the official Batmobile or the vehicle that Batman is using in this particular diorama or setup. Nevertheless, however, this is ultimately so far one of my favorite McFarlanes, and I might just be feeling a little bad not having covered this McFarlane figure a whole lot sooner. Nevertheless, I appreciate you guys for watching till the end of this video. If you guys want to see some more McFarlane figure reviews I have coming up here in the near future, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Check out this other video showing up on screen for past McFarlane figure reviews I've done. And as always, guys, stay humble. I'll see you on the next one.